white police officer stops a black woman outside the courthouse and rudely orders her to leave the area. When she refuses, he uses force, shoving and beating her, unaware that he is assaulting a judge. Will he be able to get away with it? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this gripping story. Leave a comment. What would you do in this situation? The early morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, and the cool breeze did little to calm the tension rising inside Amanda Brun. The day had just begun, but she already sensed that it would be one of the most challenging of her career. As a highly respected judge, Amanda was no stranger to pressure, but today was different. The case she was about to oversee had become a symbol of the city's ongoing racial tensions. It was yet another instance of police brutality, but this time the entire community was watching. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, would be scrutinized, debated, and either celebrated or condemned. There was no room for error. Standing on the courthouse steps, Amanda scanned her familiar surroundings. Protesters had already gathered, their signs raised high, as chants demanding justice echoed off the towering buildings. The media was set up nearby, their cameras focused, ready to capture every moment. Police officers stood along the perimeter, attempting to maintain order, though their presence only seemed to escalate the tension. Amanda inhaled deeply, her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. She had handled high-profile cases before, but this one felt personal. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. There was no time for distractions. She straightened her shoulders, mentally preparing herself for the day ahead. Each step toward the courthouse entrance felt heavier, as if the city's expectations were pressing down on her. Just as she reached the steps, a sharp voice cut through the air. "You can't be here. This area is restricted." Amanda turned, surprised to see a tall, broad-shouldered police officer approaching her. His posture was tense, his hand resting on his belt as if he expected trouble. His expression was hard, and his narrowed eyes were filled with suspicion. "I'm sorry?" Amanda raised an eyebrow, her tone calm but firm. "I said you can't be here," the officer repeated, now only a few feet away. "This is a courthouse, not a place for random citizens to wander around. Move along." Amanda's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her composure. She had encountered authority figures like this before and had learned how to handle difficult officers. Still, this time, it cut deeper than usual. "Officer Thompson," she said, reading the name on his badge. "I believe you're mistaken." "I'm not mistaken," he interrupted sharply. "This area is restricted. You don't belong here." His words struck Amanda like a slap in the face. She didn't belong here? Taking a deep breath, she fought to remain calm. She didn't have time for this. Today was too important to waste energy on an argument with an uninformed officer. "I am Judge Amanda Brun," she said, her voice steady, though frustration simmered beneath the surface. "I'm here to preside over today's case." For a brief moment, confusion flickered across Officer Thompson's face, but it quickly turned into a smirk. "Trud, you kiddin', right?" he scoffed. "You don't look like a judge." Amanda felt the sting of his words, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't the first time someone had doubted her authority simply because she was a black woman. She had spent years proving herself in a system that often underestimated her. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not kidding." Thompson's smirk faded and he stepped closer, his hand still resting on his belt. His tone dropped, becoming more threatening. "Listen," he growled, "I've had enough of people pulling stunts around here. Just move along before you regret it." The man's pulse quickened. Disbelief and anger surged within her. This was a courthouse, her courthouse. And here she was, being threatened by a police officer who refused to listen. Her voice remained steady, but inside she was seething. "I don't think you realize the mistake you're making, officer." Before she could finish, Thompson grabbed her arm. His grip was tight, his frustration palpable. "Don't make this difficult," he hissed. Amanda's adrenaline spiked. Yanking her arm back, she demanded, "Let go of me!" Instead of releasing her, Thompson tightened his grip. Then, in a flash of anger, he shoved her. Amanda stumbled backward, her heels slipping on the courthouse steps. Before she could regain her balance, she fell hard, crashing onto the concrete. A sharp pain shot through her side as her skin scraped against the rough ground. For a moment, everything blurred. The pain, the shock, the disbelief. How could this be happening? The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as she struggled to catch her breath. Around her, murmurs and whispers spread through the growing crowd. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the scene, while others stood frozen in shock. "Is that Judge Bruna?" someone muttered. The murmurs grew louder. Dozens of eyes were on her, yet no one moved to help. They just watched. Officer Thompson's face paled as realization dawned on him. The anger drained from his expression, replaced by something else. Panic. "I didn't," he stammered, stepping back. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Then, a voice cut through the commotion. "Officer Thompson." Amanda recognized the voice instantly. J.C.B. Harris, her equals, longtime friend and trusted colleague. He pushed through the onlookers, his face a mix of fury and concern. "Amanda, are you okay?" He knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly over her arms. "I'm fine," she muttered, though the sharp pain in her side told a different story. Every breath was a struggle, her head spinning from the impact. Jacob turned his attention to Thompson, his voice filled with rage. "What the hell is wrong with you? Do you even know who she is?" Thompson didn't answer. He was already backing away as more police officers arrived. The chaos swirled around Amanda, but her mind was racing. "I need to get inside," she whispered to Jacob. "I need to be in that courtroom." Jacob hesitated. "You need to go to a hospital." "I can't," Amanda insisted. "Not now, not today." Jacob studied her face for a moment, then sighed. "All right. But you're getting checked out as soon as possible." He helped her to her feet, her body screaming in protest. The crowd parted as they walked toward the courthouse entrance, whispers following them like a wave. Amanda blocked it all out. She had bigger problems to face now. Amanda squared her shoulders, keeping her frustration in check. She had dealt with situations like this before, but something about this encounter stung more than usual. "I'm Judge Amanda Brun," she said, her voice steady despite the irritation building inside her. "I'm here to preside over today's case." For a brief second, Officer Thompson hesitated, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by a smirk. "Judge Brun, you're kidding, right?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't look like a judge." Amanda felt the sting of his words, but refused to flinch. This wasn't new to her. Throughout her career, people had doubted her authority simply because she was a black woman. It wasn't the first time someone had assumed she couldn't possibly hold a position of power, and unfortunately it wouldn't be the last. But she refused to let this man's ignorance shake her. "No," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm not kidding." The smirk on Thompson's face vanished. He took a step closer, his hand still resting on his belt, his tone lowering to something more menacing. "Listen," he growled. "I've had enough of people pulling this kind of crap around here. Just get moving before you regret it." Amanda's pulse quickened, disbelief and anger surging through her. This was a courthouse, her courthouse, and yet she was being threatened like an unwelcome intruder. She held her ground, her voice unwavering. "I don't think you realize the mistake you're making, officer." Before she could finish, Thompson's hand shot out, grabbing her arm. His grip was firm, his frustration palpable. "Don't make this difficult," he hissed. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. A surge of adrenaline rushed through her, her mind barely processing what was happening. Instinctively, she yanked her arm back, her voice sharper now. "Let go of me." Instead of releasing her, Thompson's grip tightened. Then, in a sudden flash of anger, he shoved her. Amanda stumbled, her heels slipping against the courthouse steps. Before she could regain her balance, she fell, landing hard on the ground. A sickening thud echoed in her ears as pain shot through her side. She gasped, her body jolted by the impact. The cold concrete scraped her skin, and for a moment everything blurred. The pain, the shock, the sheer disbelief. How could this be happening? A metallic taste filled her mouth, and as she reached up to touch her lips, she saw blood smeared across her fingertips. Around her, voices rose, murmurs and whispers rippled through the crowd. People had stopped to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, while others simply stood frozen in shock. "Is that Judge Brun?" someone muttered nearby. The murmurs grew louder, a wave of realization spreading through the onlookers. Yet no one moved to help. They just stared, too stunned to act. Officer Thompson finally seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions. His face paled as he looked down at her, the anger draining from his expression, replaced by something else. Panic. "I didn't," he stammered, stepping back, his hands slipping from his belt. The distant sound of sirens wailed, growing louder by the second. But in that moment they felt too far away, like an echo in the background of her spinning thoughts. Then a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Officer Thompson." Amanda recognized the voice instantly. Jacob Harris. Her longtime friend and trusted colleague pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of fury and concern. "Amanda, are you okay?" he called, rushing to her side. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering over her as if unsure where to help first. I'm fine," Amanda muttered, though every breath she took sent a sharp pain through her ribs. Her head was still spinning, her body still reeling from the fall. Jacob turned his attention to Thompson, his voice rising with barely contained rage. "What the hell is wrong with you? Do you even know who she is?" Thompson didn't respond. He was already backing away, retreating as more officers arrived at the scene. The newly arrived officers moved in, the tension in the air thick as they assessed the situation. Amanda, still dazed, could hear their voices, but her focus remained on the faces around her. The weight of the stares, the silent judgment from those who had just witnessed her assault, pressed down on her like an unbearable burden. Jacob placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Amanda, you need medical attention." "No," she said, shaking her head slightly. "I need to get inside. I need to be in that courtroom." Jacob's face twisted in concern. "Amanda, you can't just—" "I have to," she insisted, her voice resolute despite the pain. Jacob hesitated, searching her expression for any sign that she could handle what was ahead. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he nodded. "All right," he conceded, "but after this, you're getting checked out, no arguments." Amanda gave a small nod of agreement, though her mind was already shifting to what came next. Jacob helped her to her feet, her body screaming in protest. Her vision blurred for a moment before clearing. The crowd parted as they made their way up the courthouse steps, whispers following them like a tidal wave. The moment she stepped inside, she knew things had changed. This was no longer just another case. This was personal. The assault she had just endured was already spreading across social media. The press would have a field day. The protests outside would only grow louder, and soon the whole city would demand justice. For the first time that morning, Amanda truly realized the weight of what had just happened. And she wasn't going to let it go. The area around Amanda was a blur of movement, voices rising in confusion, but she felt herself fading into the background of the chaos. Her body still trembled from the shock of it all, yet her mind was already racing, trying to process what had just happened. "I need to get inside," Amanda whispered to Jacob, her voice barely audible over the noise. "I need to be in that courtroom." "No, you need to go to the hospital," Jacob insisted, his expression firm. Amanda shook her head, gritting her teeth against the pain. "I can't. Not now. Not today." Jacob hesitated, scanning her face for any sign that she was strong enough to handle what was coming. Finally, after a long moment, he sighed in resignation. All right, he conceded. But you need to get checked out as soon as possible. Amanda gave a small nod of agreement, though her mind was already fixed on her next move. She allowed Jacob to help her to her feet, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. The sudden movement made her vision blur momentarily before it cleared. The crowd, still gathered in stunned silence, parted as she and Jacob made their way up the courthouse steps. Whispers followed them like an unrelenting tide, but Amanda blocked them out. She had bigger problems to deal with now. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Amanda could feel the weight of every gaze on her as she walked down the hallways. It was impossible to ignore the bruises forming on her face or the blood crusting at the corner of her lip. But she refused to stop. There was too much at stake. Jacob walked beside her, his phone buzzing every few seconds. He glanced at the screen, his face grim. "The media already has the footage," he muttered. "It's all over social media. This is going to explode." Amanda swallowed hard, her mind racing with the implications. "I know," she whispered. As they approached her chambers, they were met by Laura Adams, the police commissioner. Her sharp blue eyes narrowed as she took in Amanda's disheveled appearance. "What the hell happened out there?" Laura demanded, her voice low but filled with authority. Amanda sighed, leaning against the doorframe for support. "Your officer happened." "Thompson?" Laura's jaw tightened at the mention of his name. She muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "Damn it, I'll handle this." "No," Amanda interrupted, her voice stronger now. "You won't handle this, Laura. This goes beyond a simple disciplinary action. He assaulted me. That's not something you sweep under the rug." Laura's gaze flickered for a moment, tension crackling between them. "You know the implications of this, Amanda," she said carefully. "We're in the middle of a high-profile case. The last thing this city needs is another scandal involving the police." Amanda's eyes hardened. "I don't care what the city needs. What I need is for justice to be served. You can't protect him this time." For a long moment, Laura didn't respond. Then, with a heavy sigh, she nodded. "Fine, I'll start an internal investigation, but you know this is going to get messy." "I'm prepared for that," Amanda said, her voice steady. As Laura walked away, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of what was coming was far heavier than she was ready to face. By the time she had composed herself and returned to her chambers, the video of her fall had already spread across the internet like wildfire. News outlets were picking up the story, protest leaders were amplifying the outrage, and social media was buzzing with debates and calls for justice. The courtroom she had entered earlier that day no longer felt like a place of law and order. It had become a battlefield. Amanda sat behind her desk, wincing as she shifted her bruised body in the chair. The dull pain in her side had grown sharper, and each breath she took reminded her of the force with which she had hit the ground. Yet the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional storm brewing inside her. She had faced prejudice before, but this was different. Being physically attacked by a police officer, a man sworn to uphold the law, cut deeper than any words ever could. Reaching for a cold compress, she pressed it against her cheek, feeling the bruises already darkening beneath her skin. She needed to think. She needed to plan her next move carefully. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the name flashing on the screen was one she trusted. Jacob. She swiped the screen and pressed the phone to her ear. "The video's gone viral," Jacob's voice came through, tight with concern. "The media is running with it, and the protests are already escalating." Amanda closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. She could hear the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. "And Thompson?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Still no word from him directly," Jacob replied, "but the department's issued a statement saying they're launching an internal investigation. It's standard procedure, but we both know what that means." "They're going to try to bury this," Amanda muttered. Jacob sighed on the other end. "That's exactly what they'll do if we let them. They'll paint it as a misunderstanding, say Thompson was doing his job, and that you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this..." This isn't just about you, Amanda. This is bigger. Amanda set the compress down and leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the growing crowd of protesters outside. The anger, the frustration, the cries for justice. It wasn't just about her case anymore. This incident had become a catalyst for something larger. People were fed up, and she couldn't blame them. "I'm not letting this go," she said firmly, her grip tightening on the armrests of her chair. "Thompson assaulted me, and if we don't hold him accountable, what message does that send?" "Agree," Jacob said. "But we need to be smart about this. The police department's already circling the wagons. They've been protecting people like Thompson for years. He's not the first, and he won't be the last unless we do something about it." Amanda exhaled slowly, knowing he was right. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about an entire system that allowed officers like Thompson to act with impunity. She had to go deeper. She had to expose the rot at the core of the police department, even if it meant putting herself at greater risk. "Start digging," she said quietly. "I want to know everything about Thompson, his past cases, his complaints, everything that's been swept under the rug." Jacob didn't hesitate. "I'm on it. But Amanda, be careful. This isn't just about him anymore. If we go down this road, we'll be facing more than just Thompson." "I know," she replied, her voice unwavering, "but I'm not backing down." She couldn't afford to? The pain in Amanda's body reminded her of the force with which she had hit the ground, yet the physical agony paled in comparison to the emotional storm brewing inside her. She had faced prejudice before, but being physically attacked by someone sworn to uphold the law cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced in her career. Pressing a cold compress against her cheek, she felt the bruises already darkening beneath her skin. Her mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Going to the hospital wasn't an option she could entertain, not yet. She needed to stay focused. But ignoring what had happened wouldn't be wise either. Her phone buzzed again, flashing a familiar name. Jacob. Without hesitation, she swiped the screen and pressed the phone to her ear. "The video's gone viral." Jacob's voice was tight with concern. "The media is running with it, and the protests are already escalating." Amanda closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. She could hear the tension in his voice, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. "And Thompson?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Still no word from him directly," Jacob replied. "But the department issued a statement claiming they're launching an internal investigation. It's standard procedure, but we both know what that means." "They're going to try to bury this," Amanda muttered. Jacob sighed on the other end. "That's exactly what they'll do if we let them. They'll paint it as a misunderstanding, say Thompson was just doing his job, and that you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this isn't just about you, Amanda. This is bigger." Amanda set the compress down and leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the protesters gathering outside. Their anger, frustration, and cries for justice weren't just about her case anymore. This incident had become a catalyst for something far greater. People were fed up, and she couldn't blame them. "I'm not letting this go," she said firmly, her grip tightening on the armrests of her chair. "Thompson assaulted me, and if we don't hold him accountable, what message does that send?" "I agree," Jacob replied, "but we need to be smart about this. The police department is already circling the wagons. They've been protecting people like Thompson for years. He's not the first, and he won't be the last unless we do something about it." Amanda exhaled slowly, knowing Jacob was right. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about an entire system that allowed officers like Thompson to act with impunity. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she had to go deeper than just pressing charges. She had to expose the rot at the core of the police department, even if it meant putting herself at greater risk. "Start digging," Amanda said quietly. "I want to know everything about Thompson, his past cases, his complaints, everything that's been swept under the rug." Jacob didn't hesitate. I'm on it. But, Amanda, be careful. This isn't just about him anymore. If we go down this road, we'll be facing more than just Thompson. I know, she replied, her voice unwavering. But I'm not backing down. As Amanda hung up the phone, the door to her office swung open. Laura Adams, the police commissioner, walked in. Her uniform was as crisp as ever, her expression hard and unreadable. She closed the door behind her and folded her arms across her chest, locking eyes with Amanda. I've already started the internal investigation, Laura said, her voice clipped. Thompson will be suspended while we review the incident. Amanda leaned forward in her chair, her gaze never leaving Laura's. That's not enough. Laura's jaw tightened. Amanda, you need to think about what you're doing here. We're in the middle of a high-profile case. The department is already under scrutiny. If this gets out of control, it could cause even more unrest. Amanda's voice was sharp and unwavering. It's already out of control, Laura, and not because of me. Thompson didn't just make a mistake. He assaulted me in broad daylight in front of witnesses. That's not something you can just sweep under the rug. Laura exhaled heavily, rubbing her temples. You know the implications of this, she muttered. The last thing this city needs is another scandal involving the police. Amanda's eyes hardened. I don't care what the city needs. What I need is for justice to be served. You can't protect him this time. For a long moment, Laura didn't respond. She stood there, staring at Amanda as if weighing her options. Then, with a heavy sigh, she nodded. Fine, I'll start an internal investigation. But you know this is going to get messy. I'm prepared for that, Amanda said, her voice steady. But as Laura walked away, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of what was coming was far heavier than she was ready to face. That's not enough, Laura. You and I both know this is bigger than just suspending him, Amanda said, her voice firm. Laura's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. Amanda, you need to think about what you're doing here. The department is already under a microscope because of the other cases. If this blows up, it's going to set us back years. We need to handle this delicately. Delicately? Amanda's voice sharpened, frustration boiling over. He assaulted me in front of witnesses and it's all over the news. How exactly do you plan on handling that delicately? I'm trying to keep the peace, Laura replied, her voice unwavering. You know as well as I do that if this turns into a full-blown scandal, it's not just going to hurt Thompson. It's going to tear this department apart. We're already losing public trust. The last thing we need is more division. Amanda took a step forward, closing the distance between them until they stood face to face. The tension between them was almost palpable, years of friendship and professional respect hanging in the balance. This isn't about keeping the peace, Laura. This is about justice, and if we don't start holding people like Thompson accountable, then we're no better than them. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The silence between them was thick, weighted by unspoken truths. Laura's eyes flickered with something, maybe regret, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. You know what you're asking for, don't you? Laura said finally, her voice low. If you pursue this, it's going to get ugly. You're not just taking on Thompson, you're taking on the entire system. Amanda didn't blink. I know exactly what I'm doing. Laura's expression hardened. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. With that, she turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Amanda standing alone in the suffocating silence. The walls of her chambers suddenly felt too small, too confining. She had always known that fighting for justice wasn't easy, but now it felt more personal than ever. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a victim of the very system she had sworn to uphold, and she was determined to tear it down if that's what it took. Later that day, Amanda sat alone at her desk, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The bruise on her cheek had darkened, a constant reminder of the morning's events. Outside, the protests had grown louder. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the video had gone viral. Reporters, activists, colleagues, everyone wanted a statement. But Amanda knew she had to tread carefully. Every word she spoke would be scrutinized, twisted, and dissected by the media and the public alike. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up as Jacob stepped in, his face set in a grim expression. He shut the door behind him, his movements tense. "I've been looking into Thompson," he said, his voice low. "It's worse than we thought." Amanda frowned, leaning forward. "How much worse?" Jacob didn't answer right away. Instead, he dropped a folder onto her desk. Amanda hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. "He's been involved in multiple incidents," Jacob continued. "Racial profiling, excessive force, even a few cases of alleged brutality." Amanda's stomach churned as she scanned the pages. Each line, each report, painted a picture of a man who had abused his power time and time again, and yet he had always managed to escape consequences. "How has he gotten away with this?" she muttered. Jacob exhaled sharply. "That's the real question, isn't it? Every complaint, every report, it all just disappeared. No investigations, no disciplinary action. It's like he's untouchable." Amanda clenched her jaw, her hands tightening around the edges of the folder. She had expected corruption, but seeing it laid out in front of her like this made it even more real. "This goes deeper than just him," she murmured. Jacob nodded. "Yeah, and we need to find out exactly who's been protecting him." Amanda took a deep breath, steadying herself. The fight ahead would be brutal, but she had made her choice. There was no turning back now. "I'm not letting this go," she said, her voice unwavering. "We expose everything." Jacob met her gaze, his expression serious. "Then we'd better be ready for what comes next." Reports of racial profiling and excessive force filled the pages. There had been complaints against Officer Thompson before, many of them, but they had all mysteriously disappeared. No investigations, no consequences. It was as if he was untouchable. Amanda felt a knot form in her stomach as she flipped through the documents. Each page revealed more evidence of misconduct, more stories of people who had suffered at Thompson's hands. Yet each case had been buried, swept under the rug by a department determined to protect its own. "This goes deeper than just him," Amanda murmured, her fingers trembling as she reached the last page. "Who's been protecting him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what we need to find out," Jacob replied, his tone serious. "Whoever it is, they have a lot of power. And if we go after Thompson, we're not just going after one corrupt cop. We're taking on the whole system that's been covering for him." Amanda leaned back in her chair, the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had always known that corruption ran deep, but seeing it laid out in front of her in black and white made it all the more real. This wasn't just about justice for herself. It was about exposing the rot at the core of the police department. And that kind of fight came with serious risks. But she couldn't back down, not now. "I'm not backing down," Amanda said quietly, more to herself than to Jacob. "We're going to see this through." Jacob nodded, though concern was evident in his expression. "Just be careful, Amanda. This could get dangerous." Amanda met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready." The following day she walked through the courthouse hallways with her head held high. The tension was thick, whispers following her everywhere. She could feel the weight of every glance, the way people's eyes lingered too long on the bruises darkening her face. The atmosphere in the building had shifted. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was the center of a storm that was only growing stronger. She knew the media was waiting for her outside, eager for a statement. The pressure was building, and it wouldn't be long before this situation exploded into something much larger. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. As she entered her chambers, she noticed a small envelope sitting on her desk. Frowning, she picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper with hastily scrawled words. Her blood ran cold. She stared at the note, her mind racing. Who had sent it? Someone within the department, someone higher up? A warning, perhaps? A threat? She crumpled the paper in her hand, her jaw tightening in defiance. This was exactly what Jacob had warned her about, but she wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. Quickly, she shoved the note into her drawer just as Jacob walked in. His expression was grim. "Everything all right?" he asked, eyeing her carefully. Amanda forced a smile, though she could still feel the lingering edge of fear gnawing at her. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." Jacob nodded, taking a seat across from her. "I've been digging into Thompson's history," he said, his tone dark. "It's worse than we thought." Amanda raised an eyebrow. "How much worse?" Jacob exhaled, then dropped a thick folder onto her desk. "Has been involved in multiple incidents, racial profiling, excessive force, even a few cases of alleged brutality," Jacob explained. "But every time, the complaints just disappeared. No investigations, no consequences. It's like he's been protected." "Huh?" Amanda's stomach churned as she flipped through the pages. The pattern was unmistakable. Thompson had left a trail of destruction, and someone had been making sure he never faced consequences. "By who?" she asked, her voice tight. "That's what we need to find out," Jacob said. "But whoever it is, they have a lot of power." Amanda leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was a system, a network of corruption and cover-ups, and she had just stepped right into the middle of it. But as the fear gnawed at her, she forced it aside. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. "I'm not backing down," she said, her voice steady. Jacob studied her for a moment before nodding. "I didn't think you would." The air outside the courthouse was thick with tension. The chants of protesters echoed against the walls, growing louder with each passing minute. Amanda stood at the window, watching the crowd gather. She could feel the full weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She had filed charges against Officer Thompson, but she knew this was just the beginning. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Quietly, more to herself than to Jacob, Amanda repeated, "I'm not backing down." Jacob smiled faintly, though there was a hint of worry in his eyes. "I didn't think you would." In that moment, Amanda knew that whatever came next, she wasn't alone. Outside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. The chants of protesters echoed off the stone walls, growing louder with every passing minute. Amanda stood at the window of her chambers, watching the swelling crowd gather. Their signs raised high, their voices demanding justice. She felt the full weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had filed the charges against Officer Thompson, but she knew this was just the beginning. The court case was officially underway, and with every step forward, it felt as if she was stepping deeper into a battle she couldn't afford to lose. Turning from the window, her thoughts swirled with the chaos that awaited her in the courtroom. The walls of the courthouse felt like they were closing in, the air thick with whispers and murmurs that added to the suffocating atmosphere. This wasn't just about Thompson anymore. The investigation was unearthing more corruption than she had anticipated. The deeper she and Jacob dug, the clearer it became that the system was far more rotten than they had imagined. A knock at the door startled Amanda from her thoughts. Jacob stepped in, his face tense, his phone buzzing incessantly in his hand. "They're ramping up their defense," he said, closing the door behind him. "Thompson's legal team is going to throw everything they have at him, and at us." Amanda sank into her chair, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into her bones. The bruise on her face had darkened, a constant reminder of the assault she had suffered at the hands of the very system she was now fighting. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight she carried. "He expected that," she said quietly, folding her hands on the desk. Jacob exhaled sharply, his jaw clenched. "They'll try to make this about everything except what really matters. They'll focus on the media attention, the protests, anything to distract from the fact that Thompson attacked you. They're going to paint you as the aggressor, make it seem like you provoked him." Amanda sighed, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Let them try. The truth is on our side, and we have the evidence to prove it." Jacob nodded but didn't look convinced. True, but evidence doesn't always win in court, especially when you're up against a system that's been protecting people like Thompson for years. Amanda met his gaze, her resolve hardening. That's exactly why I can't back down. If I don't fight this, then what's the point? They'll just keep getting away with it. Jacob studied her for a long moment, his expression filled with both admiration and concern. You're right, he admitted. But you're gonna need more than just determination to win this. Amanda leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She knew Jacob was right. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for the soul of the city, for the people who had been silenced and oppressed by the very institutions meant to protect them. I'm ready, she said, though the knot in her stomach told her otherwise. Before Jacob could respond, the door to her chambers swung open again. Laura Adams, the police commissioner, strode in, her face set in a hard line. We need to talk, Laura said without preamble, closing the door behind her. Amanda straightened in her chair, locking eyes with Laura. She had expected this conversation sooner or later, but the tension between them had been building for days. What is it, Laura? Amanda asked, her voice steady. Laura's sharp blue eyes flicked from Jacob back to Amanda. This has gone too far, she said. The department is in chaos. The protests are getting worse and the media is running wild with this story. We need to control the narrative before it spirals even further out of our hands. Amanda's jaw tightened. I'm not interested in controlling the narrative. I'm interested in justice. Laura let out a frustrated breath. Justice, she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Do you think dragging this department through the mud is justice? You're putting everyone at risk. The officers, the public. This isn't just about you anymore. Amanda stood, her patience wearing thin. This was never just about me, she shot back. This is about a corrupt system that has been protecting people like Thompson for years, and you know it. Laura's face hardened, but for a brief moment Amanda saw something flash in her eyes. Something almost like guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Be careful, Amanda, Laura warned, her voice low. You're making enemies. Powerful enemies. This isn't just about Thompson anymore. There are people in high places who don't want this getting out. You're risking more than just your career. Amanda met her gaze without flinching. I'm aware of the risks, but I'm not backing down. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The silence between them was thick, their shared history pressing down on the conversation like an unbearable weight. Finally, Laura sighed, shaking her head. Fine, she said, her voice clipped. But don't say I didn't warn you. With that, she turned on her heel and left the office, leaving Amanda standing in the suffocating silence once again. She had always known that fighting for justice wouldn't be easy. But now it felt more personal than ever. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a victim of the very system she had sworn to uphold. And she was determined to tear it down, no matter the cost. I'm not interested in controlling the narrative, Amanda replied coolly. I'm interested in justice. Laura's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. Justice? She scoffed. You think dragging this department through the mud is justice? You're putting everyone at risk, the officers, the public. This isn't just about you anymore. Amanda stood, her patience wearing thin. This was never just about me, she said firmly. This is about a corrupt system that's been protecting people like Thompson for years, and you know it. Laura's face hardened, and for a brief moment Amanda saw something flicker in her eyes, something that looked like guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Be careful, Amanda, Laura warned, her voice low. You're making enemies, powerful enemies. This isn't just about Thompson anymore. There are people in high places who don't want this getting out. You're risking more than just your career. Amanda met her gaze without hesitation. I'm aware of the risks, she said, her voice steady. But I'm not backing down. For a long moment, Laura didn't respond. The silence between them was thick, the weight of their shared history pressing down on both of them. Finally, Laura sighed and shook her head. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. "But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, Laura turned and left the office, leaving Amanda standing in suffocating silence once again. The trial began the following week and the courthouse was packed. Reporters, protesters, and spectators filled the building, eager to see what would unfold. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Amanda took her seat at the front, her posture rigid but composed. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the whispers circulating behind her back, but she refused to let it shake her. Jacob sat beside her, flipping through his notes, though Amanda could tell his focus was on her. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked quietly. Amanda nodded, though the knot in her stomach had only grown tighter. "I don't have a choice." Jacob glanced at the defense table where Officer Thompson sat with his legal team. The officer's face was calm, almost emotionless, as if none of this fazed him. Amanda felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she pushed it down. She had to stay focused. The judge entered the room and the trial officially began. Thompson's defense attorney, Carl Davis, was one of the most notorious lawyers in the state. He was known for manipulating public opinion, for twisting narratives to suit his client's needs. Amanda knew she was in for a fight. Davis stood, his presence commanding as he addressed the courtroom. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and confident. "What we have here is a tragic misunderstanding. Officer Thompson was doing his job, protecting the courthouse, when this unfortunate incident occurred." Amanda clenched her fists under the table, willing herself to stay calm as Davis continued. "My client believed he was dealing with a civilian who posed a potential threat to the courthouse. It was only after the incident that he realized the tragic mistake he had made. But a mistake, ladies and gentlemen, is all it was." Davis turned to face the jury, his voice softening. "Officer Thompson is a man who has dedicated his life to protecting this city. He made a mistake, and for that he is deeply regretful. But we ask that you consider all the facts before rushing to judgment." He sat down, his face calm, as if he had just given a lecture on traffic violations, instead of defending an officer who had assaulted a sitting judge. Amanda's pulse raced, but she kept her face neutral. Jacob leaned over, whispering, "Don't let him get under your skin. Stick to the fact." Amanda nodded, standing as the judge gestured for the prosecution to begin. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. Amanda's voice was steady and clear as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here today to discuss a mistake. We are here because Officer Thompson used excessive force against me. He did not ask questions. He did not assess the situation. He acted out of prejudice and aggression." Her eyes swept across the jury, their attention locked on her. "Officer Thompson saw me, a black woman, standing on the courthouse steps and assumed I didn't belong. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't verify his information. He acted on bias, and in doing so, he assaulted me." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. "This isn't just about me. It's about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long. Officer Thompson is part of a system that believes some people don't belong in certain spaces, that some people are threats simply because of the color of their skin." Finally, Amanda's gaze locked onto Thompson. It was the first time she had looked at him since the trial began. His face remained emotionless, but she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. "We are here to hold him accountable, not just for what he did to me, but for what his actions represent." Amanda sat down, her pulse still racing as the courtroom fell into a tense silence. The trial moved quickly after that. Each side presented its evidence, called witnesses, and argued their cases. Thompson's colleagues testified on his behalf, painting him as a dedicated officer who had simply made a mistake. They spoke of his years of service, his loyalty to the department, and the stress he had been under that day. But then came the video. The footage, captured by multiple bystanders, played on the screen for the entire courtroom to see. Thompson's voice was clear as day, his aggression unmistakable as he pushed Amanda, sending her crashing to the ground. Gasps rippled through the jury. Even some of Thompson's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Davis, Thompson's defense attorney, tried to downplay the video, calling it a snapshot of a much larger picture. But the damage had been done. The jury had seen what they needed to see. As the trial neared its end, the tension in the room grew. Outside, the public had grown even more restless. The chants for justice echoed through the courthouse, a constant reminder of the stakes at hand. Then, just before closing arguments, a bombshell dropped. Jacob burst into Amanda's office, his face pale, his hands trembling as he clutched a folder. "We found something," he said, his voice tight. Amanda frowned, standing quickly. "What is it?" Jacob hesitated for a moment, then handed her the folder. Inside were documents, names, dates, evidence of a much larger conspiracy. "Thompson's been involved in more than just this," Jacob said quietly. "There's a network, other officers, high-ranking officials. They've been covering for him. This goes way beyond what we thought." Amanda stared at the papers in her hands, her heart pounding. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Thompson wasn't just a bad cop. He was part of a system, a corrupt system that had been protecting him and others like him for years. "What do we do with this?" Amanda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob met her gaze, his expression serious. "We expose it. All of it." The courtroom was silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of those present, as all eyes were fixed on the judge who would soon deliver the final verdict. Amanda sat at the prosecution's table, her palms slightly sweaty as she clasped her hands together in her lap. The weight of everything, the fight, the accusations, the truths revealed, pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The trial had taken weeks, and now, finally, the jury was ready with their decision. Across from her, Officer Thompson sat, his face unreadable. His hands rested loosely on the table in front of him. His attorney, Carl Davis, whispered something to him, but Thompson didn't respond. He seemed lost in his own thoughts. The jury returned to their seats, and the judge called for silence. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath as the jury foreman stood, a single piece of paper in his hand. The jury find the defendant, Officer Thomas Thompson, guilty of abuse of authority and assault. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen in silence. Then a wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Gasps, whispers, even a few sighs of relief. Amanda felt her shoulders relax, the tension she had been holding for weeks finally releasing as the words settled in. They had won. Jacob, seated beside her, leaned over and gave her a tight hug. "You did it, Amanda." Amanda nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The relief was overwhelming, almost too much to process at once. She looked across the courtroom at Thompson, whose expression had finally cracked, his face twisted in disbelief and anger, and his attorney struggled to calm him as officers approached. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order in the courtroom, and the room slowly quieted. "Officer Thompson, you have been found guilty of abuse of authority and assault," the judge said sternly. "This is a serious offense and represents a breach of the public trust placed in you as a law enforcement officer. Sentencing will take place in a separate hearing, but let this serve as a reminder. No one is above the law." As the officers moved to escort Thompson out of the courtroom, Amanda couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. She knew he was a product of the system, a system that had enabled and encouraged this kind of behavior for far too long. But that didn't excuse his actions. He had to face the consequences, just like anyone else. The tension in the room didn't dissipate as the jury was dismissed. Instead, it seemed to shift, the energy changing from anxious anticipation to something more uncertain. What came next? The verdict was a victory, but it was only the beginning. Thompson sat at the defense table, his expression blank, his hands resting loosely in front of him. His attorney, Carl Davis, leaned in and whispered something to him, but Thompson didn't respond. He seemed lost in his own thoughts. his mind racing as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The jury returned to their seats, and Judge Reynolds, overseeing the trial, called for silence. The air in the courtroom grew thick with anticipation. Everyone seemed to hold their breath as the jury foreman stood, a single piece of paper in his hand. And Chief Alagorn, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Thomas Thompson, guilty of abuse of authority and assault." For a moment, the courtroom was frozen in silence. Then a ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Gasps, whispers, and even a few sighs of relief. Amanda felt her shoulders relax, the tension she had been holding for weeks finally releasing. The words echoed in her mind. They had won. Thompson was guilty. Jacob, who sat beside her, leaned over and gave her a tight hug. "You did it, Amanda," he whispered. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The relief was overwhelming, almost too much to process at once. She had known this trial would be a battle, but she hadn't realized just how much it had drained her until this moment. Her gaze shifted across the room to Thompson. His expression had finally cracked. His face twisted in disbelief and anger as his attorney struggled to keep him calm. The bailiffs approached, prepared to escort him out. Judge Reynolds banged his gavel, restoring order to the courtroom. "Officer Thompson, you have been found guilty of abuse of authority and assault. This is a serious offense and represents a breach of the public trust placed in you as a law enforcement officer. Sentencing will take place in a separate hearing, but let this be a reminder, no one is above the law." As the bailiffs moved in, Amanda couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. She knew Thompson was a product of a system that had enabled and encouraged this kind of behavior for far too long. But that didn't excuse his actions. He had to face the consequences just like anyone else. The tension in the courtroom didn't disappear, even as the jury was dismissed. Instead, it shifted. The atmosphere changed from anxious anticipation to something heavier, something more uncertain. What came next? The verdict was a victory, but it was only the beginning. Later that afternoon, Amanda stood on the courthouse steps, facing a sea of protesters and journalists. The crowd had grown even larger since the trial began. Their signs waved in the wind, their chants for justice filled the air. Amanda took a deep breath, steadying herself before scanning the faces of those who had gathered. Some were hopeful, others still burning with anger over the injustice that had brought them all here. Among them, she spotted John Marshall, a journalist who had been following the story from the very beginning. He pushed his way through the crowd, microphone in hand. His eyes, sharp but filled with respect, met hers as he stepped forward. "Judge Brun, now that the verdict has been delivered, how do you feel?" Amanda paused, glancing at the faces in the crowd once more. She could see it. The hope, the anticipation. They wanted to hear that this was the end, that justice had been served. But she knew better. "I feel relieved," she said finally, her voice clear and steady. "But I also know that this is just the beginning. Today's verdict was about one man, one case. But the system that allowed this to happen is still very much in place. That's what we need to focus on now." John nodded, scribbling in his notepad. "So what's next for you? What's your next move?" Amanda's jaw tightened slightly as she considered his question. "I'm going to keep fighting," she replied, her voice firm with determination. "I'm going to push for real reform in this city, in this system. We can't stop now." The crowd erupted into applause. Amanda felt a swell of emotion rise within her. The fight ahead would be long, exhausting, and difficult, but she knew she wasn't alone. She had the people behind her. Her strength grew as John moved away to speak with others. Amanda felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Jacob standing there, his expression soft but serious. "You all right?" he asked. Amanda nodded, though her body ached and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "Think I am." That evening, Amanda returned home, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. She had barely walked through the door before her phone started buzzing with notifications, messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had seen the trial and wanted to offer their support. She placed her phone on the table, rubbing her temples. The fight was far from over. Today had been a victory, but it had also shed light on just how deep the corruption ran. The documents Jacob had found were damning, implicating not just Thompson but others within the police department and even city officials. Amanda knew that if she pursued this, she would be risking everything, her career, her safety, even her life, but she couldn't ignore it. Not now. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She walked over and opened it to find Jacob standing there, a bottle of wine in one hand and a tired smile on his face. "I figured you could use this," he said, holding up the bottle. Amanda smiled, stepping aside to let him in. "You figured right." They settled into the living room, their wine glasses filled. The warmth of the drink slowly eased the tension in Amanda's body. They sat in silence for a while, the events of the day replaying in her mind. After a long pause, Jacob spoke. "You know this is just the beginning, right? Once you press forward with those documents, they're gonna come after you hard." Amanda stared into her glass, her voice soft. "I know. But I can't let it go, not after everything." Jacob nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm with you, whatever you need." Amanda looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Jacob. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Jacob smiled, raising his glass. "Justice." Amanda hesitated for a moment, then raised her glass as well. "Justice." They clinked their glasses together, the sound soft in the quiet room. But to Amanda, it felt like the loudest sound in the world, a declaration, a promise that she wouldn't back down. The night wore on, and the exhaustion that had been gnawing at her finally began to fade. She allowed herself to relax, to breathe. The battle ahead would be brutal, but for now, in this quiet moment, she let herself believe that things could change. Maybe, just maybe, they had taken the first step toward a better future. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and challenges she couldn't even begin to anticipate. But as she sat there with Jacob, the warmth of the wine and the promise of support filling the space between them, Amanda knew one thing for sure. She was ready. Whatever came next, she wouldn't be alone. And for tonight, that was enough. Life lessons from Amanda's story teach us that justice is not a passive pursuit. It requires courage, resilience, and unwavering determination. Amanda faced systemic corruption, personal attacks, and the weight of an entire city's expectations, yet she refused to be silenced. Her story is a reminder that speaking out against injustice may come at a cost, but silence allows oppression to thrive. True change begins when we stand our ground, even in the face of adversity. We must hold those in power accountable and never allow fear to dictate our choices. Justice is a fight worth enduring, no matter the risks. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Leave a comment and share your opinion. Also, check out the other videos on our channel. We have many more exciting stories you'll love.